Hello everyone, Jolene here from Bookworm Adventure Girl. Welcome back, and if you are new, thanks so much for checking out my channel. Please hit subscribe and stick around. The lighting in here isn't the best. The sun went down as I was preparing, so we're gonna do what I can, because today I'm gonna share the 9 books that I read in November, and I'm going to put them into different categories. First for Nonfiction November, then the Skoden Readathon, and I have a couple of fiction books to share. So Nonfiction November is hosted by Olive at A Book Olive, and Olive gave us 4 prompts that we could use, and I didn't necessarily follow these, but some of the books, well, I guess all of the books do actually fit into the prompts. So the prompts were border, element, record, and secret, and I just happened to have 4 nonfiction books. And the first one begins. I imagine you are in the International Space Station, curving over northern North America. And this is from Ice Walker by James Raffan. And this would fit into the element category the best, I think, because it talks about climate change and the importance of ice in the Arctic for both polar bears and the people of the North. So I mentioned in an earlier video that this is considered creative nonfiction. I didn't have this on my nonfiction radar because I thought that it was fiction. So when I saw it come up on a nonfiction list, I checked it out. The story is about a polar bear named Nanu and her 2 cubs as they trek through the Arctic and its changing weather and climate. And Nanu is based upon a real polar bear named Huxley, who the book is dedicated to. And Huxley and Raffan had a relationship. They knew each other. So the book, I guess, is considered nonfiction because of the nature writing, and maybe many elements are fact. But Nanu and the cubs are not. They are inspired by Huxley. And personally, I'd be really interested in that story, the relationship between James Raffan and Huxley. So my disappointment in this book is because of, I think, my own expectations. I had seen a few interviews and I read some reviews that talked about how the story was told from Nanu's perspective. And I thought, that was what would make this a unique read, but I didn't find that it was really told from the bear's perspective. It was told from someone observing the bear and telling the bear's story. So I think that there would be more of an emotional connection to Nanu, and that didn't happen for me. So what is done very well in the story is that the reader becomes more aware of the relationship between the bears and the importance of the ice, their relationship to seals and the 2-leggeds, and just the general life cycle of a polar bear and their fight for survival. The book also shows great respect for Indigenous peoples and their cultures, especially their relationship to the land and animals. And I struggled quite a bit with the whole creative nonfiction because I'm not really sure what the difference might be than, say, historical fiction. So there are facts in historical fiction books, but it is still fiction. And I'm not sure that you can say something is fact or nonfiction if it really isn't. So I don't know. I thought the whole idea of the genre was an interesting one to think about. The book is still worth a read for anyone interested in polar bears and how the Arctic is being affected by climate change. The next book begins, having been born a free man and for more than 30 years enjoyed the blessings of liberty in a free state, and having at the end of that time been kidnapped and sold into slavery, where I remained until happily rescued in the month of January 1853, after a bondage of 12 years, it has been suggested that an account of my life and fortunes would not be uninteresting to the public. This is from 12 Years a Slave by Solomon Northup. And first, I love this edition from Canterbury Classics. I love the feel of these books, and I like how it has words. I don't know if you can see that in the number 12 on the front. The end pages are great. And then in the corner of all the pages, there's a violin, because Solomon Northup was a violin player. So this is a slave narrative of a man who was born free in New York, and he lived a good life with his family, his wife, and children until 1841, when he was tricked by slave traders to go to Washington City. There he was sold into slavery. And I already knew this story because I had seen the movie when it first came out, but I'm really glad that I read the book too. There are some brutal scenes in both the film and the book. I was trying to think if I had read a similar story, and I don't think that I have. I mean, I've read many books about slaves, but not quite like this. Solomon is definitely an interesting character. He's an educated man, and he has to downplay that in order to fit in and kind of play this new role that he finds himself in as a slave. And I thought that the book did a better job at explaining how he becomes free again, at least from what I remember. I don't remember the film, that gave too much detail about that. There is more of an understanding, I think, from the narrative. So I guess if I was going to put this into one of the categories for Nonfiction November that Olive gave, it could really be record or border, since it's a record of the 12 years that Solomon was enslaved, but also border because he crossed several borders when he was kidnapped. So this is definitely worth a read. I mean, it's a classic, and I would recommend it to anyone who wants to learn more about Solomon and learn more about his unique story. This nonfiction book begins: there are many ways to look at the past, as a list of important dates, a conveyor belt of kings and queens, a series of rising and falling empires, or a narrative of political, philosophical, or technological progress. And this is from An Edible History of Humanity by Tom Standage. The prompts that probably best fit this would either be element or border. It's talking about the different elements of food and how food has traveled. So I think it could work for both. This was an interesting read, and I learned a lot about the history of food and how it has shaped our lives. It talks about the main staples of different areas like rice, maize, or corn, how spices started to be used and why they became so valuable and expensive. It also talks about food before farming, which is not something that I ever thought about, something I take for granted for sure. And then it definitely talks about how food has been used throughout history for power, especially during times of war. People in power use food to keep their power or to gain more power. Sometimes it's been used for financial gain, and I thought that this was a really interesting way to look at food and think about how and why it has been important or used during different time periods. So this would be, I think, a good book for anyone who is interested in history and kind of looking at food, the food that we consume every day through a historical lens. The final nonfiction book I have for today begins like this. In Chicago at the end of the 19th century, amid the smoke of industry and the clatter of trains, there lived two men, both handsome, both blue-eyed, and both unusually adept at their chosen skills. And this is from The Devil in the White City, Murder, Magic, and Madness at the Fair That Changed America by Erik Larson. And I have heard so many great things about this book and this author, so I had very high hopes, and For me, this book was fine, but it did not blow me out of the water, which is what I was expecting. I loved the setting for the book, which was the World's Fair in Chicago in 1893. The two men that are referred to in that opening line are Daniel Burnham, who was an architect and responsible for the planning and the construction of the fair. And then the other man was H.H. Holmes, who was a charming, good-looking man, pretending basically to be a doctor when in fact he was a serial killer. So I think that is why I would put this in the secret category for Nonfiction November. I mean, it's not exactly the kind of thing that you lead with. You know, there was no, I'm Dr. Holmes and I am a serial killer. So anyway, the concept of bringing these two characters together and these two stories together was so intriguing to me, and there are many things that I liked about the book. I liked the contrast between the two characters and the stories, and as I said, I loved the setting, and the writing was definitely really well done. I liked learning about what was going on in the world at that time and why this fair was so important. I also liked learning about the first Ferris wheel and, you know, different things like that. So in some ways, though, the execution of the two stories coming together fell a little flat. I mean, there's a guy on the loose killing people, so I was expecting a bit more anticipation and build up and tension. And there is a bit at the end, but it almost feels too late. And I guess I just had hoped that it would kind of intertwine the stories more and flow better as one story. And sometimes it just felt disjointed. Still worth checking out if you are interested in, especially if you enjoy true crime and want to learn more about the World's Fair and Chicago in the late 1800s. I do have another book by this author, so I will definitely give that a go as well. Those are the nonfiction books I finished. Now, if you remember back to, you know, when I talked about all of the books that are on my radar, there were a lot that I didn't get to, and many that I read that weren't actually necessarily on my radar. I do have a couple that I started but didn't finish in time, so for instance, you might remember that I talked about H is for Hawk and reading that with Sandy's read-along, and I have a few more chapters to go with that one. And I also attempted to start reading Yes, I Can by Sammy Davis Jr. with my mother, and we got probably about 30 or 40 pages in, and my mom has no desire to go back to this book. As you may remember, she is not a reader. I attempted to listen on audio with her so that she wouldn't have to listen to my voice, but yeah, no success. So I think I'm going to end up kind of working through this one on my own. So you will probably be hearing, hopefully, about those in those nonfiction books when I do my December wrap-up. Hopefully I can get to them. So let's move on to the Skoden Readathon, which was hosted by Kim at Native Lady Book Warrior, who started this readathon basically to get people reading more Indigenous authors. And this is something that I do anyway. And I ended up reading 3 books for the Skoden Readathon. And one of them was my favorite read of the month, so I'll be telling you about that. But I'm going to start with the novel that begins like this. A guard handcuffs me and pushes me away from the visitor station. This is from A Minor Chorus by Billy Ray Belcourt. And this was longlisted for the Giller Prize this year. And it's Billy Ray Belcourt's debut novel. I've read his memoir in the past and really enjoyed it, and this reads a lot like the memoir, which was interesting. The narrator in this is unnamed. He is a writer from northern Alberta, like the author, and he puts aside his dissertation to go back to the res to write a novel, and he connects with different people on the res. So we get their stories and the narrator's story as well. So this felt like it was autobiographical. And I think if it actually was, I would have enjoyed it more. It had what I love about Billy Ray Belcourt's books, which is really the use of language is beautiful. It's often poetic. Belcourt is a poet, and there are some really moving moments in the story. What I think was missing, and it was hard for me to pinpoint exactly what that was, but I think it was that I never really connected to the main character, to the narrator. I always felt like he was at a distance, and for some reason the story just never really grabbed me. I still need to read Belcourt's poetry, and I will definitely read anything else that he publishes because I love his writing. I think I just had, greater expectations for this. So this is a good read if you are already a fan of Belcourt's writing. If you like reading books with queer characters, and just for the writing alone, there are often times that I reread sentences from Belcourt's books just to savor them. The next book begins, "My father once told me that before I was born, no white man walked our land. No church sat next to our village, no black robe circled our wigwams with their endless prayers." And this is from Daughters of the Deer by Danielle. This book was gifted to me by a subscriber and friend, Karen Weatherald. And I want to say to Karen, thank you for this beautiful gift. Daughters of the Deer is another debut novel, and it was beautiful and heartbreaking. It was my favorite read of the month, and I think my only 5-star read this month as well. The story takes place in the 1600s in Trois-Rivières, which is in Quebec, when the French settlement was just beginning. And we meet Marie. She is a healer and an Algonquin woman who has experienced devastating loss. And the chief believes that if she were to marry one of the white men, it could help to save their people. So Marie marries Pierre, who throughout the book, I had very mixed feelings about Pierre. He was dedicated to this new life and to New France. And while reading, I would see his goodness, and then he would do something or say something that kind of raised red flags, and then I would go back to seeing his goodness, and I think that happened pretty much until the end. So Pierre doesn't understand Marie and the ways and beliefs of her people, and Marie doesn't understand Pierre's Catholic faith and his ways either. So they often find themselves at odds with one another, especially when it comes to passing on their traditions. So Marie and Pierre have a daughter named Jeanne, and as she gets older, it is pretty clear that she is two-spirited, and she is in love with a young woman named Josephine. And in Marie's tradition, two-spirited people are revered, but the law says that Jeanne must marry a man by her 18th birthday. And for the new settlers, including her father, Jeanne is sinful and evil. And this tension and the idea of living in two different worlds is palpable. The characters in this novel are well developed. It's hard to watch them struggle, both internally and with one another. The mother-daughter relationship is beautiful, and the father-daughter relationship is, I think, the one that I think gives this book its movement. The words of this novel flow so beautifully, and when I was done, I just held the book for a little while. It's one that I will cherish for a long time. So this is a good read for anyone who is interested in Indigenous stories, especially that are not often told. If you like to read stories with two-spirited characters, and again, just for the writing alone, it is worth it. But prepare your hearts for this one. The final book that I read for the Skoden Readathon was a poetry book that begins. I was born at the University of Alberta Hospital. And this is the beginning of Whitemud Walking by Matthew James Weigel. This book is from Coach House Books, and it's a book that really needs to be experienced. It uses a variety of elements, photographs, poetry, documents, diagrams, and other text to make its point. The setting would be Edmonton and surrounding area, which is where the author is from. And he is looking at himself in contrast to the colonial history of Canada. And he looks at these documents, especially treaties, and in very clever ways shows how they were used to colonize, or how they are understood, how they're understood by Indigenous peoples' views, and how that differs from how the government used them to take land. The archives and how they are used in the book is genius. And as I said, it is more of an experience than it is, reading a story. So I will show you some of what the inside pages look like, so you can kind of get an idea. I think when I hauled this book, I might have mentioned that when I first received it, received this from the publishers Coach House Books, I actually checked with them because I thought that there might have been a printing error, because I'll show you here, you can see that only half of the page is showing, and this is not a printing mistake. There's a whole bunch like that. It's actually intentional, and it's to show, among other things, that the treaties were not just about the text, that's only half the story. The treaties are about so much more, and yet they are not treated or understood that way. So by reading this, you will learn more about that. So this is a good book to pick up if you are interested in having an experience, if you are interested in learning about treaties and archives, and definitely if you know the Edmonton area, then this would be worth checking out. And I will definitely have one more book to talk about in December that I had hoped to finish in time for the Skoden Readathon. I picked up All the Quiet Places by Brian Thomas Isaac, and I finished it, I think, like the 2nd of December, so it didn't quite make it here, but that's something to look forward to in December. So that leaves me with 2 books left, and both of these are fiction books, and both would be considered romances. And the first is a historical romance, which begins. Elizabeth Middleton, 29 years old and unmarried, overly educated and excessively rational, knowing right from wrong and fancy from fact, woke in a nest of marten and fox pelts to the sight of an eagle circling overhead, and saw at once that it could not be far to paradise. And this is from Into the Wilderness by Sarah Donati, and this is the first of 6 books in the Wilderness series. And these were recommended to me several years ago by a friend of mine who is a librarian and knew that I really enjoyed the Outlander series by Diana Gabaldon. And it's true that if you are a fan of that series, then you will most likely enjoy this as well. In fact, Jamie and Claire from the Outlander series are mentioned in this story. There are several similarities. The writing style often feels very similar. It is a sweeping epic story like Outlander. It has a strong female character lead. It's a mammoth of a book. This comes in, I think, almost 900-ish pages. But there are differences, and there's no time travel. This one stays in the late 1700s. And Elizabeth Middleton is the main character. She's an Englishwoman and a teacher and a spinster, and she leaves England to go to upstate New York, where her father has land. and her hope is that she will find independence and a fresh start in a new life. And she meets Nathaniel Booner, who is a Mohawk man, but her father has plans of his own and wants her to marry Richard Todd, who is a doctor. And the father has his own secrets and reasons for doing things, and Elizabeth has to make a decision to follow her heart and her desire for independence, or to do what will benefit her father and family. So there were many times that I was captivated by this story, and that it kind of pulled at the heartstrings. I enjoyed the characters, I think, the most, and, you know, the themes of rebelling against customs, especially for women. I think I will eventually read more in this series. I think I even have them all, but I think I also need a break from it, so it's not one that compelled me to immediately pick up the next book. This would be for anyone, obviously, who is already a fan of the Outlander series, as I said, if you like historical romances, and if you like writing that has a lot of detail and description. The final book on my wrap-up pile for November is also a book that's part of a series, and the first line goes like this. "It's all fun and games until someone shits their pants." And this is from Isn't It Bromantic by Lyssa K. Adams. This is the 4th book in the series, and you might recall that when I was reading the 3rd book, I said that the series was kind of starting to take a bit of a nosedive for me. So the series had a lot riding on this book as to whether or not I would continue reading them. And I am happy to say that I really enjoyed this one. The idea of this series is that a group of men, well-known public figures in Nashville, have a book club where they read romance novels to solve problems with their love lives. And each book has focused on a different man in the group. So first was Gavin Scott, the baseball player. The second book was a restaurateur, Braden Mack. The third was Noah Logan, who is a computer security expert guy. And then this book is about Vlad, who is often referred to as the Russian. And Vlad is the professional hockey player. And I loved this story because up until this point, Vlad has been kind of the character that has been used as comic relief. And he's been, in some ways, the most mysterious. But in this story, we learn the truth about his marriage to his childhood friend, Elena. And this one has, I think, some surprising bits, but also has all of the things that I loved about the other books in the series, which is funny. It's funny. The romances are believable, even though, you know, sometimes I think the book club is a little bit hokey. It's still something different. And these books have something that we don't often see, which is male friendships. So men supporting each other and being there for each other. So although you don't have to read the series in order, I would actually recommend reading them in order. I think because it helps to kind of know the characters and how they have developed before getting to this point. So there is a 5th book out, and it came out in November, A Very Merry Bromance, which focuses on the country singer Colton Wheeler, I think it is. So I don't have that book yet, and it may have to wait until next Christmas. But because I really enjoyed number 4, I will continue with the series. There is also a companion romance story coming out sometime next year. So that's a possibility too, and it's basically the book that they read in the first book. So this book would be good if you are already a fan of the series, if you were looking for a lighthearted and funny romance. Then yeah, I'd say check this out. So those are the 9 books that I read in November. Let me know your thoughts. Have you read any of these? Are there any that you would like to read? If you participated in Nonfiction November and or the Skoden Readathon, did you have a favorite read? Anything that you would recommend? I'd love to hear all about that. I look forward to chatting with you in the comments. Thanks again for watching. I hope you enjoy the rest of your day, and don't forget to make every day an adventure.